If I could please have your attention, we will begin our seminar at this time. Good afternoon. My name is Alex Atilano Orozco, and I am a Dean's Ambassador for the UCR School of Public Policy. I am excited to welcome you all to today's installment of the Water Seminar Series. I will be serving as your MC for this seminar, which is titled Left in the Dust, Pecuniary and Environmental Externalities in Water Markets. Today's seminar is part of the UCR School of Public Policy's Water Economics and Policy Outreach activities called Water Dialogue, Getting to Know Your Water Agencies and Policymakers, which is led by Dr. Mehdi Namadi. Water policy design and implementation involve the policymakers, the agencies that apply the policy, and the public that is subject to the policy. California has long been subject to many water policy interventions. Opening a dialogue among the public, the water agencies, and the policymakers would enhance the implementation of better and more effective water policies. You can learn more by going to waterdialogue.ucr.edu. But before I hand it over to our special guest, Dr. Eric Edwards, for his presentation, I would like to first quickly go over the format for this event. Dr. Edwards will present for about 30 to 45 minutes. Afterwards, we will hold an audience Q&A for about 15 minutes. For our Zoom audience, please input your questions via the Q&A feature on our Zoom webinar. And for our in-person audience, please raise your hand and speak loudly when asked so our Zoom audience can hear you. At this point, I'm delighted to introduce all of you to our guest speaker for today's seminar. Dr. Eric Edwards is an associate professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at UC Davis. His work in agricultural and natural resource economics focuses on groundwater governance, historical agricultural development, and water rights and markets. His recent publications examine the economic outcomes of formal water rights settlements on American Indian reservations and the economic and the environmental justice outcomes of saline lake desiccation. His work has been funded by agencies such as the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and National Science Foundation. He holds a PhD in Economics and Environmental Science from UC Santa Barbara. Prior to UC Davis, he was an assistant professor at Utah State University and an assistant and associate professor at NC State University. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Edwards.
All right, thank you. Thanks for that great introduction. And I'm excited to be here. How many of you are MPP students? Is that Master of Public Policy? That's the major of it. And undergraduates? Couple. Okay. All right. So this is an economics talk. Not all of you are economists. I will do my best to make this clear, but there's going to be some technical language. Don't let it get in the way of understanding the main ideas of what I'm trying to get across. We'll see what I may skip over a few slides that are more technical in nature. Again, I'm making that decision. You don't have to worry about what was on those slides. The point in the message will get across nonetheless. So I realized as you're saying, we probably could have done a better job marketing this if I made a much less technical title. I sent this to him before Mehdi told me what exactly the audience was. He's told me subsequently, but I didn't update my title, which I probably should have. So this paper is about the Salton Sea. For those of you who don't know, it's much closer here than almost anywhere I've ever presented before. But this is in Imperial County, just south of here, a little east, is an inland terminal saline lake. So a lake that doesn't have any outlets, right? The water flows in, and the only way it goes out is by evaporating. These are kind of lakes that are kind of in this delicate balance between inflows and outflows. And what I want to talk about is kind of the decline of the Salton Sea, and meaning it's shrinking, and the relationship to a big water transfer that took place between Imperial Irrigation District and Imperial County and the County of San Diego. And what I'm interested in, I've changed the title. I took pecuniary out So distributional, who gets what out of the transfer, right? And then environmental outcomes or externalities, like what were the spillovers? What happened to the environment? And in this case, the desiccation, the drying out of the Salton Sea, did that cause problems for the environment? And how can we look at examine those? All right, so to motivate, I want to start with just thinking about the water reallocation in the Western US. So why water reallocation? Well, when the Western US was settled, right? There were native tribes, some of which were doing agriculture or claimed they were doing some irrigated agriculture. But generally, right, there's a westward expansion, there's a bunch of water resources, and they're all claimed for irrigated agriculture, or almost all the water is claimed for irrigated agriculture, right? White settlers are moving west to get land to grow stuff, and as a result, right, all the water ends up in irrigated agriculture. Even today, in most states, 80 to 90% of the consumptive water use, the water that's being used up, right, is going into agriculture. So this is not just true in the Western United States. All the arid and semi-arid regions in the world have this issue where most of the water is being used in irrigated agriculture. And it's not an insignificant or unimportant part of agriculture, right? 55% of crop value in the US is on irrigated land. A lot of that is here in California, where we grow a lot of the highest value crops in the world, right? I flew in from Davis this morning, right? I flew over like the Fresno area where they're producing almost all the almonds that the world uses, right? We're producing almost all the pistachios the world uses. If you go to Ventura County, right, you got your ground fruits, especially strawberries. It's, a large share of U.S. production is coming from that. So very valuable agriculture, but there's also less valuable agriculture, and they're using a lot of water. So, there was a study, and I think this comes from a study that actually Lucy Levers did, and she was a PhD student here at UC Riverside when she did it, working with Kurt Schwabe, and they looked at Imperial Irrigation District, which is right next to the Salton Sea, and they found that something like if you fallowed, and I'm nervous now presenting, if you fallowed land in IID, right, and you were willing to pay, $285 per acre foot of water. I'll talk about what that means just in a second, right? That you would get a large over 1 million acre feet of water at that price, right? So that's, if you were to offer farmers $285, you get all this water that they say, I don't need to farm with that. I'd rather just take the money, right? On the other hand, in 2003, so over 20 years ago, right, and water's only gone up in value, San Diego was paying up to $680 per acre foot. I'm guessing that's going to be, well over $1,000 now, maybe closing in on $2,000, their willingness to pay for water, right? So just how much water are we talking about? What is an acre foot, right? So we measure water in the Western US in acre feet. An acre foot is, if you think about an American football field without the end zones, that's about an acre. You cover that with 1 foot of water, that's an acre foot of water. That's a lot of water, right? That's enough water in California, probably for 2 houses for the year, 2 families of 4 for the year to use, right? So you think an acre foot of water, maybe that could be a couple houses for the year, 8 people, right? We're talking, you offer them $285, you get 1 million acre feet, 1.25 million acre feet. Well, how much acre feet are they actually using there? If we're talking about, right, 1 million acre feet would be enough for, this would be enough for 2.5 million houses, right? Well, Imperial Irrigation District has rights to about 3.1 million acre feet of Colorado River water, right? So this is the largest single water rights holder on the Colorado River. And so, right, a lot of it's in agriculture. We think, okay, well, San Diego needs more water, it's growing. How do we get water? So, right, this is where we're talking about water reallocation. But it's not being reallocated, right? Instead, the water is being continue to be used in agriculture, and there's scarcity, right? So what's happening, right? Reservoirs are being drawn down, rivers are going dry, right? Urban utility, people are tearing out lawns. Mehdi was talking about Metropolitan Water District, Los Angeles, paying people $7 per square foot to tear out their lawn, right? Whereas we're talking about, $285, that's for 1 acre foot. Farmers in Imperial might be putting 3 to 5 acre feet per acre. So think about 5 feet of water just on your land each year to irrigate crops. So we've got a reallocation problem, right? So the question is, how should we think about the reallocation problem, right? And for economists, we think, okay, well, you have a buyer, San Diego, or in some cases, an environmental nonprofit who wants more water in the river, or in another case I'm working on, a state and environmental groups who want water to fill up a saline lake, the Great Salt Lake in Utah, right? They're willing to pay a lot of money for water. And then you have, agriculture. There's some really valuable agriculture, right? There's also people growing alfalfa, making maybe $100 an acre or something like that. They're willing to sell. So you say, okay, well, what happens? Let's get a market going, economists, right? Free market. Let's sell some of the water out of agriculture to urban areas, right? Well, when you do that, you start to generate some political opposition, right? So the first thing you generate is this, well, when we move water out of agriculture, we're going to lose jobs, right? And so this is that word pecuniary externality. It's not really an externality. It's kind of an old-fashioned term. That's why I took it out of the title. But it's basically saying when you change resource allocation in an economy, do prices change in such a way that some people who weren't involved in that transaction are going to be hurt? Now, economists don't think of that as a real externality because prices change all the time, and that's the way we want the market to react, right? But it's not necessarily, people don't necessarily think like economists, right? So if you transfer a bunch of water out of Imperial Irrigation District, maybe you lose a bunch of jobs, and people don't want that. So they say, keep the water here, keep the jobs here. The other thing that can happen, right? And this is economists would call a real externality. This is a real spillover. This can affect overall welfare or overall gains from trade, right? So you have this big trade. San Diego's better off. They pay the farmers. They're better off, right? Maybe some ag employees lose their jobs. They're worse off, right? Then what happens if the reduction of water hurts the environment, right? And in this case, moving the water out of Imperial County reduced the size of the Salton Sea, which exposed a bunch of the lake bed, which has this fine sediment on it, maybe full of contaminants, really easily turned by wind into dust, and it creates this dust pollution problem, right? Whoever bears the cost of that dust, right, is negatively affected. So you have a transfer over here between two parties getting a lot of gains from trade, a lot of benefits, and then the dust is blowing over here, right, hitting a group over here. They're not getting any of these benefits. They're bearing a cost, right? So this is, again, what we're talking about with distribution, right? You have a bunch of gains over here. The distribution is loss of jobs, right? And, environmental impacts. Okay, so the big motivation here for this paper and sort of the paper in economics is trying to explain to other economists, in a sense, why do we see so few water transfers when the potential gains from trade are so high, right? And the reason that we're arguing is like these other costs are potentially fairly high. Maybe they're not big enough to justify canceling the trade, but maybe they are big enough to convince people in the area of origin, the place that's transferring water out, to fight against the transfer. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the effect, how big are these effects, right? And then a little bit on who receives the benefits. So I'm kind of presenting one paper. I'm going to try to do kind of some of the stuff. I'll skip over some of the technical details, present it kind of quickly, because it's sort of the first paper that I'm presenting is, okay, what was the change in Imperial County? What happened to Imperial County from before to after this transfer? And we're going to use some methods, statistical methods, to try to estimate that. We had a follow-on paper. The original paper is not yet published. The follow-on paper is published last year that looked at, okay, well, who's affected by the environmental externality? And what we showed is it's largely, as you might expect, if you've been to Imperial County and been around the Salton Sea, the people affected by the dust are what we would call environmental justice or disadvantaged communities, right? Poorer, less white, more likely to speak, to have larger levels of language diversity, right? What we think of as like kind of potentially communities that have less political power, less ability to, get some of those benefits from the transfer over to their community. So we'll talk a little bit about that here as well. Okay. So real briefly, I'm going to talk about how the transfer works and how it affects the lake, and how it affects labor. It's going to be real brief. And actually for the paper, we're still kind of figuring out the best way to explain this to economists as well. Then we're going to do some statistical analysis to look at the predictions that we get from this model on what happened when this transfer occurred. And what do we find, right? We have some reductions in labor, employment in agriculture, and we get big increases in dust pollution. And, that there's dust pollution in Imperial County has been documented before. That the dust is coming off of Salton Sea has been documented, right? Our goal with this is to sort of show that it's coming from as the result of this transfer agreement. And as we get into it, what you'll see is it's not just the transfer agreement, it's how the politics of how the transfer agreement was set up determined the timing of when the dust pollution really kicked in. And this has been sort of a long process. That's why this paper is taking a long time. But I think we have a pretty compelling story about what happened. Okay, so basically, we can sum this up as, right, trade policy, and we're living in an era of Trump. So when I started writing this paper, we were in, I think, we might have even been pre-Trump 1.0, but it's really easy for us now to understand that trade policy is not necessarily designed to make the world better. It might be designed to appease a certain group or protect a certain interest, right? So there's a lot of old economics literature that says, okay, well, do trade policies solve some market failure or help facilitate trade? No, sometimes they're just to protect certain people, or protectionism or something like that. Water trade policies might also look like protectionism. But on the other hand, international trade or trade in natural resources can deplete the natural resource, especially when the natural resource is not fully protected, right? So that's the thing with water trade. There's these huge potential gains because cities are willing to pay a ton of money for water. Low value agriculture is not worth much. The product of water is not very low, but there's a lot of political opposition, and there's tons of papers saying that, right? Finally, what are we going to say about these terminal saline lakes and health, right? This has also been emerging over the last 10 years since we started this paper. But basically, dust is a bad pollutant. Dust causes health problems. Saline lake dust seems to be a particularly bad pollutant, causes health problems. And one example that some of you may be familiar with, so Owens Lake, which is where Los Angeles gets their water supply, was dried up in the early 1900s as Los Angeles pulled the water out, until Los Angeles did a bunch of mitigation up there. This was the single largest emitter of PM10. Those are the little bit bigger fine particles that cause people's health in the whole country, right? So if you looked at which area was emitting the most PM10 in the whole country, it was Owens Lake for a long time. Now Los Angeles has spent over $2 billion to kind of mitigate a lot of those effects. But so this dust pollution is a problem. It's a problem in the Great Salt Lake. It's a problem in Central Asia, where they have some of these saline lakes, Iran, the RLC, places like that. Okay. So Imperial County, right? Borders Riverside County, just south of us. One of the biggest ag producing counties in the whole country, despite the fact that some of it, just gets a couple of inches of rain a year. It's a desert, right? But it's really sunny desert with really fertile soil, right? Why is the soil fertile? Well, occasionally the Colorado River would slip out of its banks and flow the wrong direction. So it's sort of this alluvial deposits down there. So it's like, it's one of these things you can't see it. 11th highest in county and ag value in the US. It's not quite top 10. And you'll notice that it's 8th in California. So almost all the top ag counties are in California by value. It does melons, vegetables, sweet potatoes, a lot of alfalfa though, right? So melons, this is what as ag economists we'd say, okay, these are high value crops, right? They're worth a lot. The water to irrigate them is going to be worth a lot, right? Alfalfa is what we call a low value crop. It's the biggest alfalfa producer in California, right? So they're growing hay in the desert to feed cows and calves, right? So it's animal feed. A lot of it is, some of the alfalfa also is shipped to Arizona and things like that, right? So we're moving a bunch of water to Imperial County to grow hay in the desert to feed cows. All right, so here's the Colorado River Basin. I'm going to go quickly through this, right? But California is barely in the basin, but is in the lowest part of the basin, and Imperial County is right by that lowest part. So they took all the water first. That's why they have 3.1 million acre feet. That's why they have the most senior water rights, right? Because Western water law, the way we have it set up, is first in time, first in right. Ag got there first. Ag has the water. And California was using too much. They needed to cut back, right? Imperial was there first, so San Diego was going to have to cut back. And that's where this agreement came from, is how do we get, so San Diego, where all these people live, doesn't have to cut back their water. Can we transfer some of the water from Imperial to San Diego? All right, so how does the transfer work, right? Here's our All-American Canal, right? Before they built the All-American Canal, the irrigation went through Mexico and then back into the US. They messed up in 1905. They had a diversion dam down here. There was a big flood. The diversion dam pushed the whole flood out across this. There was no Salton Sea at that time. The diversion dam pushed it all back through Mexicali. There's even pictures of this flood through Mexicali, right? Back into the US, into what they call the Salton Sink. It's not the first time this has happened, right? This is all a very flat area. But it was the first time that people had been there who were doing agriculture. So basically for 2 years, the full flow of the Colorado River went into the Salton Sea and they filled it up, right? Then they started irrigating the Imperial Irrigation District. And eventually, going through Mexico is problematic, because then Mexico wanted some water, right? So the US eventually, the farmers in Imperial eventually convinced the US government to build the All-American Canal, so the water didn't have to go through Mexico. So then Mexico didn't need to get any water. Eventually there's a treaty, Mexico gets a little bit of water. So 3.1 million acre feet is now flowing here into Imperial. About 30% of that, about 1 million acre feet, returns to the system and flows into the Salton Sea. That's either through shallow groundwater recharge or through just tailwater, right? Water running off the field from irrigation. It flows down these rivers in the water system. That 1 million acre feet, about a year, is what's been sustaining the Salton Sea for the last century, right? So it's all water diversions flowing into the Salton Sea is sustaining the Salton Sea. So there it is. There's Imperial. There's the Salton Sea. This is a little bit old, right? It's started to shrink. So you can see now, if you look at it, you see exposed dust. I should actually try to find. And Coachella is up here, right? This is the Coachella Irrigation District. So, this is where the music festival is. This is on the boundary side of the lake. This is where Imperial Irrigation District is. So what they're going to do, they're going to transfer water. How are they going to do it? Right? Well, one would be to just stop farming, some land and transfer the water that you don't use, right? But about a third of all the water, if you turn one of these green parcels into fallow, so brown, right? About a third of the water was going to flow into the lake. Now, if you transfer all that water to San Diego, you get whatever that field was using, a third less flowing to the lake, right? So, right, if you fallow the entire district, the lake gets no inflows. And so what they do initially is they fallow, which means reducing agricultural production, and they fallow extra and send some water to the lake. That's what they call mitigation fallow, right? You're going to save some extra water, send it to the lake, so the lake doesn't. So they foresaw this problem, right? And try to fix it. IID hates that because that means there's less land and agricultural production, right? There's less employment in the community. There's less going on in Imperial County. So they move away from that to a policy of what I call intensification. Basically, they start lining all the canals. They start doing tailwater recycling. So all the water that runs off the field, they stop it, and they pump it back around. All right. They pump it back around and use it again to irrigate the water, right? So now they're intensifying. So even though, right, they're saving water, that a lot of that saved water is coming at the expense of water that would have returned flow to the lake, right? And this makes sense if you think about economic incentives. Unless I'm made as the price, as the value of water, as we trade water, the value of water rises. It's going to make me more careful with the water I use. Unless I'm made to send water to the lake, I'm naturally going to reduce the amount I'm sending to the lake. So what happens, right? And the fallowing, right? I say net fallowing because this is the total fallowing minus the mitigation fallowing. So this is the water sent out minus the mitigation fallowing. So over time, the mitigation fallowing basically is really, the net is basically really close to zero, right? So from here, this is the, the maximum amount of fallowing was maybe here, and it starts to shrink, and the gray is just the fallowing. In about 2013, they start doing these efficiency programs, and those take over. And to this day, this is how they're saving water, right? And so this is kind of the exposure of the lake bed over time. And you see there's an initial increase in lake bed exposure. And then there's, once the conservation once the intensification programs start, a lot more lake bed gets exposed, right? And that's the exposed lake bed is what's going to be correlated with the dust that's emitted, right? So I'm just going to skip over all this. Well, let's just say, so 3.1 million acre feet are coming in to Imperial Irrigation District. About 67% are being used initially in consumptive agricultural use, which means about 1 million are flowing back to the sea. They had an estimate that 1.3 million evaporates each year, but that would mean that the lake is shrinking already. I think it was basically in equilibrium. So maybe think about 1 million acre feet evaporates each year. There's about 7.5 million acre feet in the Salton Sea. We have a model, we do a bunch of stuff, but basically it's all really intuitive. You start trading water out, you have to have less water, means less agricultural production, less crops can grow. While we use labor and water together to make crops, when you reduce the amount of water overall and the amount of agricultural production, you also, reduce labor. And we sort of show that it's really based on, if you make some assumptions in the model, that effect is going to be more so on the low education, right? The farm worker labor force, they don't have as many options for substituting their labor. And because of that, right, there's water transferring out, there's intensification in the economy, right? There's less water flowing into the Salton Sea, and therefore lower provision of ecosystem service. In this case, the ecosystem service of the Salton Sea is preventing dust pollution. Okay, so we're not going to get into the empirical approach, but what we're going to do, we're going to use a number of different empirical approaches. And what we're going to essentially do is we're going to think about, we don't observe what happened to Imperial County without the water transfer, right? Why? Because there's only one imperial county in the whole universe, right? And we don't observe a second imperial county. Now, sometimes what we like to do in those cases is find a bunch of other similar counties and just compare what happens over time and see if imperial changes relative to them. That's what we call like a difference in difference. But sometimes, especially if you have just one unit that's being treated, right, we could construct, based on what happens before the treatment, we construct a synthetic imperial county. This is what, using data, this is what would have happened to an imperial county if there hadn't been a change. So we basically construct a synthetic, what we call a synthetic counterfactual or a synthetic control for what would have happened had imperial not gotten the transfer out, right? So that's what we're going to essentially going to do. We're going to use those two methods. There's a third method that's synthetic difference in difference. So there's a variety of different statistical methods. They're all going to somewhat agree, but they're going to have some differences. So basically, this is what we do, right? The black line is what actually happened to harvested acres in Imperial County, right? Now, if you just saw the black line, you'd say, well, maybe it goes down, but it also had gone up here, and like were all the other counties going down, right? Was agricultural production, harvested acres just decreasing anyway, right? 2008, there's an economic downturn. How do we think about that? Well, what we do is we use a bunch of other counties to construct a synthetic counterfactual. This gray line is a synthetic imperial county, right? And you can see that we match it in the pre-period, and then we let it go and see what happened in the post-period. So this difference is like the difference of what we think the effect of the policy was after 2003. And the way we show these is the black line is that difference, right? So it's this gap here, we call a gap plot. And then the other gray lines are placebos. So placebo means these are counties that didn't actually get treated with the water transfer, but we do the same procedure on them, construct their synthetic counterfactual, and then see what happens. And the reason we do that is because we want to know that what happened in Imperial, right, was not just that by chance Imperial saw these negative shocks just by chance, right? So if we try all the other counties in California and say we ran the same synthetic control approach on them, and it turned out that out of all, I don't even know how many counties, 50 other counties we used, right? Turns out that difference for Imperial was the largest decrease out of all those other ones. So the other ones didn't actually receive the policy treatment. The one that received the policy treatment also had the largest difference. So what we're looking for is years where Imperial is the lowest. That would imply some form of statistical significance, and sort of there's a way of calculating that statistical significance down there, which we do. And so what you can see is like there's a number of years where it's the lowest, but these big decreases here, notice there's a bunch of other counties that weren't treated that also had those big jumps. So we're actually less inclined to believe, right? There's lower statistical significance here, that bigger jump is actually caused by the transfer, because other counties saw it. There could be other things going on in other counties correlated with Imperial. And so that could be indicative of a different effect coming from somewhere else. But these ones, right, and it's sort of cyclical, but some of these ones are the most, right? Then we compare that to just a difference in difference, where this is just the difference between the average of all the other counties in California and Imperial County. And what you see is the same, we're still estimating the same decline, right? But one of the things we look for in this sort of statistical method is, was it a good fit in the pre-trend period, right? Because if it wasn't, there could be things like, for instance, this is something we would look for that would suggest this might not be the best method, right? Is Imperial, right, is higher in the pre-period and starting to decline already. That could be indicative of an ongoing trend of all the other counties in Imperial relative to all the other counties in California, right? And so we're worried about these pre-trends. That's why the synthetic counterfactual, see how it's much flatter in the pre-trends. There's not as many, because that's by construction, right? We've constructed that. Here we don't have the option. This is just a comparison of means. All right. So that's the approach. I'm going to run through some of these results now. over the next 10 minutes. And I'm not going to re-go through the method. So just remember the method and how to interpret these results. But basically, this is indicative of imperial has been losing. And like we said, this one might not be as statistically relevant, but it still shows a decline, right? Imperial lost harvested acres after the transfer agreement started, right? And we expect that, right? They started fallowing. Over time, they fallowed less. You don't really pick that up in this data, although these become more shaky. Where you do pick up what happened over time is in some of just the raw data. So this is the hay and alfalfa, right? You see this big drop off initially, and then you see hay and alfalfa going back up after the fallowing period ends, and we start getting into the system efficiency period. Okay, so labor, right? We're reducing agricultural production. What do we see happen to labor, right? This is low education labor, high school or less. This is some education beyond high school, right? You see kind of declines in both, right? But these declines are not larger than these placebo counties. So the statistical significance is not, we don't see statistical significance here in the low education labor through like 2013, 2014. You see that it's declined by a lot, right? So basically, there's a reduction in farm employment among farm workers, essentially, during this time period, right? Consistent with this idea that there are labor market effects of these transfers, right? And these, again, this is the difference in difference results. We'll skip over those real quick. The other thing we look at is, okay, well, we see low wage relative to high wage declines in the model, or low education employment declines relative to high education employment. In our model, we sort of say, okay, well, what does that mean about relative wages? And what it means is high education wages should go up relative to low education wages, right? The people who have more education, or their relative wages go up. And that's what we see in the event study. This is the difference in difference event study type of framework, and in the synthetic control, right? This wage gap. So you get more inequality in, at least in the wages for ag labor, right? The highly educated people in ag labor are going to make more relative to the low educated. All right, so real quick, and I don't usually talk about this in the talk, but we're trying to figure out a way to incorporate this in. So I've put up a third method. It's similar. We've got a synthetic county and the actual county, right? We're trying to figure out what happens to labor, right? So Imperial County, throughout the entire time period, is the highest unemployment rate in all of California, right? So it's a little tricky. We'll use this. That's why I have a synthetic diff and diff approach. We can't use our other approaches, right? This is not statistically significant, so it's hard to see, did unemployment actually go up, right? Maybe, but maybe not. Why would we think, all these jobs disappeared, right? What happened if unemployment didn't go up, right? Well, probably some out-migration, probably. And here's our, we have data now earlier, but I haven't run the analysis yet. But here's our, from 2009 onward, the measure of just like kind of the raw measure of in-migration into Imperial County relative to other counties in California. And you see that for a lot of the period, like Imperial, now we don't have the pre-period, so we can't test now whether it went down, but we will eventually. But it does seem like there might be some pressure. So less people are immigrating into Imperial County than are moving out, right? So you have a negative immigration rate into Imperial County. That would suggest that the labor might have just sort of gone elsewhere. We're also going to look at, this is, I guess I should be saying emigration versus immigration, or migration. This would be migration from other US locales. Now we also have data on immigration from Mexico, which could be a big deal, right? Because there's a lot of travel across the border there. All right. So now I've got about 7 minutes left here in my 45 minutes. Let's talk about air pollution. And this puzzled us a lot at first because what we basically saw were sort of results like this. So this is PM 2.5 and PM 10. What we want to do is we're going to compare it to NO2 and ozone. PM 2.5 and PM 10 come from combustion, right? Fossil fuels, things like that, and from dust, right? Dust emissions or small particles. NO2 and ozone only come from combustion, right? So if you see an effect from PM 2.5 and PM 10, but you don't see an effect from NO2 and ozone, we can infer that that's coming from dust, not coming from combustion or some other pollution. And actually, during the time period, Imperial is in non-attainment with the Clean Air Act, so they're trying to clean up their combustion, and they have a lot of policies in place to try to reduce the amount of combustion. And that's why you can see, I mean, these ones seem relatively flat, but these are the raw means, right? And you kind of see the means, they don't seem like they're like a lot's going on, although you see kind of an uptick here in PM 2.5. But when you look at the days, right, when pollutant levels are at above the EPA limits, that's when we start to see big effects, right? So these are the days. This is PM 10. This is, how did I switch these labels? Okay, I swear I switched these labels. PM 2.5, PM 10. These are days above the EPA limits, right? You see NO2 is basically flat, ozone goes down. So there's not an increase in air pollution coming from combustion, right? But you see these increases later in the period in PM 2.5 and PM 10. What puzzled us for a long time is like, why didn't these start in 2003? I was presenting in San Diego a long time ago now, and an economist at UC Berkeley came up to me and he said, I know why they're going up around 2013. That's when they ended the mitigation fouling program. And he had been on the advisory committee that had insisted on the mitigation fouling program to begin with. Imperial Irrigation District always hated it. They agreed that they would do it for 10 years. And then they ended it. When they ended it, they did this intensification, right? So they start pulling the tailwater back. They start reducing the amount of return flows into the lake. The lake starts to dry out faster and you get this air pollution, right? So we have these big increases in air pollution, right? What does that mean, right? And so we just did a quick back of the envelope. These are the total revenues from the water transfer over time from 2003 to 2018. So you see over time, right, the price is going up a little bit, but mostly what's happening is more and more water is being transferred over time. And then we multiplied those increases in PM 2.5 by our expected health costs from increased cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, right? People getting sick and dying from cardiovascular related diseases from prior literature. So what have people found that, this size increase in PM 2.5 does to health effects? And then some neonatal stuff, right? Like how many babies would have, what's the infant mortality? How does that increase? And it's only like, right, in Imperial County, I think it's only like three babies a year, additional deaths, right? But it still has a cost to it. And so that's what this cost is, right? Is those health costs. So what you see is the revenues of the transfer, and here the revenues are, we saw the big divergence. So a lot of these are going to be pure gains from trade, kind of are higher than the potential health costs, right? And so this is where our emphasis has really been not on, oh, we shouldn't have water transfers, right? No, we need the water transfers. The whole point of this is we need to move water from agriculture to urban areas, right? The problem was like the distribution and the fact that we haven't paid attention to how, like, is there a low cost way to address this externality? And this is where I return to the Levers paper from a Riverside PhD student, right? What they found was the cheapest way to get water back to the Salton Sea. And there've now been studies looking at, like, could we pump it from the Gulf of California? Could we pump it from the Pacific? Like, how do we get water? Like, the cheapest way is just to buy more water from agriculture and just send it straight to the Salton Sea. So that's the cheapest way. Of course, right, that's going to lead to problems because that's exactly what Imperial does. The farmers there don't want to happen, right? Because that reduces the jobs. Okay. All right. So now I'm in 2 minutes. So that's the point of this paper. Now we've had a lot of trouble convincing economists. I mentioned this morning, that dust is a real pollutant. They're like, Imperial County is a desert. There's always dust. People are always exposed to dust. They're going to take mitigating procedures. So what do we do? Right? Well, we said, okay, well, we can use a physics model, right? We can get every playa point when they're exposed, and we can trace the path of their dust, and we can see where it goes, right? And so that's what we did, right? And so we're working on, I'm not going to, because this is recorded and going on YouTube, I'm not going to show you the results, but we have preliminary results on health impacts in Mexico that seem to suggest that this dust is increasing, or at least decreasing, birth weight by a pretty significant amount, or especially for the poor segment of the population in Mexico. So we should have more defined results in a working paper probably within the next 6 months or so on that. What I do want to show you as my last slide is the effect on the disadvantaged communities around the Salton Sea of the increased dust. And again, we're going to use about 2011 of that, like David Sunding told me at the in San Diego, The Economist, right? When they switched out of those policies as the switching time. And so this is looking at, right, the total particles from the Salton Sea playa, right, that are blowing up in the air and are hitting all communities, right? So there's a slight increase that are hitting all communities, right, in an aggregate. If you look down here, this is the non-disadvantaged communities. And what you see is it looks like a slight increase, but it's not statistically different from zero, right? So they do all right, right? It's these communities that we find are disadvantaged, right? Lower income, less white, and more language, more heterogeneity in languages, right? See this big increase in particle exposure, right? So again, distributionally, these particles are hitting the low-income communities, and then the follow-on paper is going to say they're also going across the border, which this paper is just in the US. They're also going across the border into Mexico and affecting Mexican communities. And again, to wrap up, I think the takeaway here is not we don't need markets to reallocate water. It's that these markets are trading something, right? But they're not trading, right? There's no trade in the thing that would protect the lake, protect the communities. And there's no, once those protections of that amenity, that ecosystem disappeared, that's when you see these big effects. So maybe 46 minutes I talked. Happy to take questions now.
Can I ask a conceptual and
Yeah.
then a technical
Yes.
question? So conceptually, your slide with the value of statistical life, if I'm understanding that correctly, are you saying that in effect, the gains from this reallocation of water to San Diego, the monetary gains are sufficient that if you theoretically could transfer those gains to the people who are suffering from the dust pollution, you could transfer enough such that they would be equal or better off than they were before this water was removed to San Diego.
Yes.
Is that what
Yeah.
you're saying? Okay.
Yeah. And another way, and I've been asked this in a different way, is like, if you could internalize these costs of this transfer, would the transfer still take place? And the answer is yes. Like, so you could do like a tax, a Pigouvian tax for the cost of this externality on the transfer, And then you could pay that tax to, you know, the harmed parties potentially, and everyone could be made better off. Conceptually, though, that's still second best
Mhm.
because you have these incomplete property rights. The best thing to do, because actually getting water to the lake to prevent dust pollution at all is actually cheaper. You could actually, my assertion is that it would actually be the cheapest solution would be to keep the water in the lake and transfer the water. But yeah, so
My technical question, am I understanding your synthetic approach correctly in that you were using as potential counterfactuals California counties, but not counties in other states? I see you nodding. Is there a reason you did that? And in particular, when you were looking at unemployment, trying to find counterfactuals for a place with 20% unemployment is going to be hard in the state of California. But other parts of the West you may have been able to find some counties that would have been better counterfactuals, even though not maybe in the same water kind of situation.
so this is a good question, and like you could be our referee. We are right now putting together that. So the reason we don't is only because there's a lot of county specific ag data that we have for California that we didn't have for Nevada and Arizona, but we found it, and so it's in PDF form. So we're digitizing it. So like how many acres of melons we're growing is one of our controls in some of the specifications. So yeah, and the second point is absolutely right. The way synthetic controls work is by including other counties, our matches can only get better. They're not going to get worse. If they got worse, you just drop those counties and give them zero waste. So that can only get better. So yeah, we're doing that. And there's, because the way we've defended it is like there are potential differences between Arizona, Nevada, and California. So you'd want the California ones first, but there's no reason not to include the other ones if you can get the data, because again, the match can only get better. Yeah.
On your harvested acreage data, I noticed there's these big spikes, 2017.
Yeah.
You got that from CDFA? No, keep going.
Oh, these ones.
Keep going back.
Look before that.
Yeah.
Here,
There.
yeah,
Your synthetic Imperial County has almost 800,000 acres in 2017. Far out of sample compared
Yes.
to everything else. And it's driven by change of acreage in other counties.
Yeah.
How confident are you in the CDFA data, assuming that you use that? Because I worked with Medi on that data, and there's errors galore in that.
Yeah.
Because,
So
I mean, I just look at that and say, that's not reasonable.
it's not reasonable, and I think, I mean, we're given a little confidence that it's also not reasonable in the way we do statistical significance, right? So, like, there's some sort of outlier there. I think it's worth looking into what happened in 2017. So yeah, so you construct these weights, and you're going to observe other counties'
Yep.
outcomes.
So they're out of bounds too. I mean,
Yeah.
they're outliers. So your synthetic, or not your synthetic counties, your other counties have a big old statistical anomaly.
Yeah, so I mean, we might be able to try to get an idea of what happened there, but I mean, sort of conceptually, you could think of like you have to assume that you're going to have some sort of stable relationship between what you're observing and your outcomes, right? And if that doesn't maintain over time, so like, I don't know, there was a big switch in some of the counties that you had weight on, and they really increased their harvested acres.
But they don't, California doesn't happen.
Right.
So then if it doesn't happen, you're left with, oh, I should check my data.
Yeah. I think it would be sensible to check the data, and you have to check Imperial's data, and you have to check probably, but the nice thing is like usually, and this is for those of you who might be interested in synthetic counterfactuals, right? Usually most of the counties get a 0 weight. So there's usually just a few counties that get weight, but we can just go in and check like what's going on with the, like, so there might be 5 or 7 counties total, what's going on, and we know that there are potential data issues. But I mean, it could just be a transcription issue too. So we'll, I think, looking into that, you know, a lot of these are, like I said, a lot of these are coming from PDFs. And so like we can go back and we have all the California has these reports every year on crops and acreage, and you can get in there and look up exactly where this came
Yeah,
from.
so let me just follow up.
Yeah.
The method by which those county reports are elicited is prone to error.
Okay.
There are county extension offices and others that they get asked, well, what do you think happened?
Mhm.
And there's no validation necessarily to it. You know, we
Yeah,
tried to
yeah.
validate it with aerial USDA pixels, and it doesn't work. So I'm just saying, be cautious to take
Yeah,
the
I
data
think
as
it's
is.
worth putting something in there about, we talked to, especially in Northern California, we talked to actually a few people, county agents, trying to figure out what was going on with the data. And so yeah, absolutely. That's a point well taken. Yeah.
How far away are we from the courts stepping in on the whole issue of Colorado urban water, since the parties don't seem to get along?
I mean, I think it's a good question.
More, that's political economy instead of just.
Yeah, so the agreement is between the states. That has to be a compact. That's like an agreement between states, and that's kind of governed by the Supreme Court of the United States. And so you could have an agreement, but the other big player is the agency, the Bureau of Reclamation. They can make some. So my guess is the Bureau of Reclamation will make some sort of, and Mehdi knows more about this than I do, will make some sort of determination that's going to adversely affect someone, probably California, and then, or all the other states. And then whoever's adversely affected by that Bureau of Reclamation decision is going to sue, and then that'll go to the Supreme Court. And I would say that's probably pretty likely, unless they can find some way to use some monetary transfers to buy off some of the lower value states. So yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Edwards, for your wonderful presentation. Now for closing remarks, thank you all to our audience members, both in person and on Zoom, and we look forward to seeing you to continue to join us at our upcoming School of Public Policy events. Next Tuesday, November 4th, we will be hosting the Persist Women's Political Engagement Conference. You can register at persist.ucr.edu. Thank you again, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at future events.